Our schematic study is tracing the outline of life and culture, and with each of our differing sessions, we're taking a text of some kind. Some of these have been works of literature, of drama, others have been theological texts, and some have been philosophical. And tonight we're going to be considering a text that falls into the realm of philosophy, Existentialism and Human Emotions. This book was written by Jean-Paul Sartre. His dates 1905 to 1980. He is the leading figure of the existentialist movement, and yet in many ways existentialism both predates Sartre, and in a lot of ways all of its teachings, at least in some way, foreshadowed what we call postmodernism that we deal with. Existentialism was not as untethered from historical Western thought as postmodernism is, but it certainly was a strong disjuncture. So what do we mean by existentialism? It comes down to the idea of existence precedes essence. In other words, what you are is a factor of what you do. Or to put it another way, Sartre himself uses the analogy of a paper cutter. I don't know why he settled on that particular piece of office equipment. It may have been the one that he glanced at in his office while he was writing that particular section, but he said someone designed a paper cutter, and they had in mind something that this paper cutter was to do, and then they fashioned it to do something. And in that case, the essence, the plan, the meaning existed before the thing existed. And this is the way we find with anything crafted by artisans. The chairs in which we're sitting. Someone had a plan for a chair, and they said we wanted to fulfill certain guidelines, certain things are to be done by this particular piece of furniture. It is to be one that is comfortable to sit in, it is to have a back for support, so forth. And then it was crafted. So you have a plan, and then that plan is what is fashioned into something. Existentialism, though, turns this on its head and says you are nothing until you act. That there is no predetermined choice for you, no predetermined guidelines for you. Now, when we begin looking at the idea that the concept of existence precedes essence, we have to go back to the gloomy Danish philosopher, theologian Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard was a very, very insightful person, very sensitive. And you're going to find that sensitive people very often, when they are in a setting, they know something is wrong, but often they can't quite put their finger on what that is. And I really think we have to be sympathetic with where Kierkegaard found himself. He was someone who was in a setting where the Enlightenment of the previous century and a half had driven away the concept of faith. And within his own country of Denmark, they had the established Lutheran Church, but it was totally wrapped up in monarchical politics. It was a wing of the government, as a state church is prone to be. And as a result, people were concerned with status and standing in the community and their power, and not really about transcendent values. So it's in that setting that Kierkegaard was writing and contemplating, and he eventually came to a point where he rejected reason and chose instead freedom or faith. For him, the leap of faith means believing something for no reason. And he uses this particular analogy. He says, if I say to a woman, I love you, and then I add any reason, then that's not real love. If I say I love you because, but instead to be real love, according to Kierkegaard, it has to just simply be a choice. And so it is, he describes faith, that one believes not because of any reason except to choose to believe. This is what he meant by a leap of faith. Now, we find people very often using the term leap of faith to just simply mean choosing faith as opposed to disbelief. Faith in the biblical sense is not something that is absurd or devoid of reason. It is, however, based on reasonable presuppositions. You believe what God has told you. Now, that's not the same thing as empirical verification. It's not what you have physically seen or felt, but neither is it irrational. It is something that you believe because you have good reason to believe. Again, not the same thing as empiricism, but neither is it irrational. For Kierkegaard, however, real religion, real faith, was a leap in the dark for no reason. Now, when we begin looking at this, we come to someone who is perhaps the most prescient, who was himself not an existentialist, although he dealt with the themes that would be covered by existentialism, and that is Fyodor Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky had a personal crisis. He had been sentenced to death and was reprieved at the last moment. And in the course of all of that, he had a snap where for him everything shifted. In his writings, he traces out the problem of humanity attempting to live as if God does not exist. And for Dostoevsky, it was quite clear this was not tenable. You could not really proceed as if God does not exist, for the famous phrase, and it's translated in various ways from the brothers Karamazov: if God does not exist, then all things are permitted. Now, this is, in point of fact, a phrase that is referenced by Sartre. And he credits Dostoevsky with this. But whereas Dostoevsky said, because of this, you have to believe there is a God, Sartre said, well, Dostoevsky's right. And so since there isn't a God, here we are. Another prescient person, one that was not a believer, but very insightful into the impact of disbelief, was Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche is the philosopher who, for the first time in a modern sense, said, God is dead. Now, what did Nietzsche mean by that? He did not mean that there was a deity who has died. What he means is, in a cultural sense, we acted as though there were a God, and that from that there flowed certain results, but that God had been driven out of popular culture. You go back before the time of Nietzsche, and the great works of art were almost universally fashioned with a view towards giving glory to God. And actually, most of them for 1,000 years had conveyed a religious message. And even those that did not were fashioned with a biblical outlook on life at the forefront. Nietzsche said, God is dead and we have killed him. Now, what was left for Nietzsche? Well, Nietzsche, and again, this foreshadows what we're seeing in postmodernism, said, since there is no God, we no longer should be concerned with right and wrong, because these are moral delineations that flow from God. All that we should deal with is power. What you are able to do, go and do it. And the strong will overcome the weak. Nietzsche, by the way, was a favorite philosopher of the Third Reich, the idea of the will to power. Another favorite of the Third Reich was Martin Heidegger. Heidegger, interestingly enough, not only was a favored philosopher of the Third Reich, he was himself a member of the Nazi Party. And following the Second World War, had to go through denazification. It's very interesting that many eminent intellectuals in Germany became caught up in the Nazi movement. Many prominent liberal theologians did. In fact, most German theologians became Nazis. And most top scientists, except for the ones who were Jewish, who had fled, most of them were either Nazis or in complicity with the Nazis. It should be sobering to us, because we're not talking about all that long ago that a very refined country of Bach and Brahms, Beethoven, would be taken over by such an atrocity. But Martin Heidegger was dealing with the implications of atheism. And one point, and we'll see how Sartre plays this out a bit, that he picked up is the idea of being forlorn. To be forlorn is a feeling of abandonment, that one has no options, that one has no hope, and one has no one with whom to empathize, no one who can talk with you. You're just on your own. All of these threads would come together and receive their clearest exposition in the writings of Jean-Paul Sartre. Tonight, we'll be looking at some of the thoughts that he brings out in his book, Existentialism and Human Emotions. He writes in this book, when we think of God as the creator, he is generally thought of as a superior sort of artisan. When God creates, he knows exactly what he is creating. Thus, the individual man is the realization of a certain concept in the divine intelligence. Now, I've got to tell you, Sartre understood the biblical view of humanity. He understood that if you believe in God as creator, then what you believe about humanity is that God has fashioned humanity according to a certain pattern. And for that reason, you are able to talk about human nature. You can call people to account for fulfilling that nature, or you can chastise them for acting contrary to that nature. Sartre understood that. But then he said, look, intellectuals do not believe in God. And by the way, Sartre viewed himself as an intellectual. He laid hold of that moniker for himself most heavily. And so he noted, in the 18th century, the atheism of the philosophers discarded the idea of God, but not so much the idea that essence precedes existence. So what is his problem with the philosophers, with Diderot and Voltaire, Rousseau? His problem with them was they were acting as if there was some overarching meaning, but they didn't believe in God. And Sartre said, look, they have acted as if there is a God. They have acted as if nothing has really changed in morals or in humanity if there is no God. They acted that way, and he said, that's not fair. It's not legitimate to act as if there is a God if you don't believe there is one. He says, thus, there is no human nature, since there is no God to conceive it. Now, this is really the point of atheistic existentialism. The idea that there is no God, and if there is no God, then you can't talk about absolutes anymore. You're left to yourself. There is no human nature. And for that reason, you are forlorn. When we speak of forlornness, a term Heidegger was fond of, we mean only that God does not exist and that we have to face all the consequences of this. Now, Sartre does not put forward that this is a happy thing. He writes, the existentialist, it should be on the contrary, thinks it very distressing that God does not exist, because all possibility of finding values in a heaven of ideas disappears along with him. Now, you look at this, and you'll find in Sartre's writing a clearer owning up to the problems of atheism than you're going to find anywhere else. A lot of other atheists try to sneak values and meaning in through the back door somehow. Sartre doesn't do that. Now, he's not consistent because no one can consistently live in this way. For example, Sartre, in his book, Existentialism and Human Emotion, specifically references that the Russian Revolution, communism in the Soviet Union, that in his view, that was the clearest expression of the workers being involved in running a country. Now, he was not well informed as to what was actually happening in the Soviet Union. The worker in the field or in the factory had no say in running the country, but the propaganda was that they were. But he viewed that as a great thing. Furthermore, he specifically viewed fascism as a very evil thing. But you have to always ask why. What begs the question. So what are the characteristics, though, that you find in existentialism? The first is the idea of forlornness. When you look at where people are with this is not a joyful philosophy. It is very gloomy. It is dark. And you'll find that most of those who embrace this purposefully attempt to suppress anything that would put forward the idea of joy. You look at the art that was produced out of this mindset. You think of Beckett's Waiting for Godot, for example, and you have something that is nonsensical because there is no sense to be made of it. And Godot, which of course stands in for God, never comes. They wait for Godot. And the entire play, these two men in an absurd conversation, waiting for Godot. And the message is, that's our lives. You live in this world, and the only meaning that you have are assigned meanings, arbitrary. You've just selected them. This then leads inseparably to the second point that Sartre makes, and that is the problem of being anxious, of anxiety. Other philosophers refer to existential angst. And what does this come down to? Well, if my meaning comes from my making certain choices, then I must attempt to impose those choices on you as well, because I have posited that these things are the way they should be, that they are the good. And there's no referee, there's no court of appeal where you and I can sort through what is or is not the good, but I have chosen it. For this reason, those who are going down this path will become increasingly obsessive. We see this in our culture with people getting involved in various kinds of panics, where they have decided that something is a certain way, and woe to anyone who does not agree with their particular outlook. Whereas if you believe there is a God, you believe that there is an overarching reason, And if I have an opinion and you have a different opinion, we have a framework of logic that really means something, that enables us in a civil way to sit down and to discuss these things. But you see, if there is no overarching meaning, then even sense, logic, and proof are just conventions. And if they don't fit my narrative, what I have chosen, then too bad for them. So the anxiousness, the agitation that is prevalent in people's minds, and then man becoming God, and this is an outflow of this. Man becoming God. And the idea being, do people really want to be God? Well, you look at the whole of it, and if you're being superficial and glib, you would say, well, of course. But if you think in terms of the responsibility, it's a very frightful thing. And yet this is where atheism leads. A quote from C.S. Lewis that we used in our last session that I think is important. Every age has its own outlook. It is especially good at seeing certain truths and especially liable to make certain mistakes. And so it is that as atheism has permeated our culture, and as the memory of God has been driven out of society, there are things that will flow from that. Some have been more insightful in seeing where this was going. Others try to pretend that nothing has really changed, but it becomes very evident it has. In one of our future sessions, by the way, Landon is going to be going through the Francis Schaeffer book, The God Who Is There, that helps provide some of the history and background of this. But what does this mean for us as Christians? 1 Peter 3:15. But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. Now we look at this, and I think this really provides a lot of the answer for what we should be doing as Christians. First of all, the reason we are to make a defense. We are to be able to reasonably discuss why we believe and the implications of it, and a matter of hope. As opposed to being forlorn, we have hope. We are not left adrift. We are not making a leap in the dark. And those who are in the dark, who are living their lives isolated, feeling alone, feeling forlorn, knowing that there are problems, but having no idea how to move forward, we have a message of hope for them. And we can share that with them. And then the idea of being anxious, the idea of always being agitated. In both Old and New Testament, the idea of peace is put forward. When you think in terms of peace, we're not talking primarily with the absence of armed strife. It's not a matter of not being at war, but it is a matter of being in harmony within ourselves, with one another, and of course, ultimately with God, who is providing meaning for all. And the idea of there being God over humanity. I'm not God. And so I don't have to act as God. I don't have to try to set straight everything that is crooked. I do not have to try to make the judgment calls for other people's lives. Now, we know that there are commandments given by God, there are insights that He provides, but you realize much of our lives are lived in areas of individual responsibility. But the fact that there is a God out there means that you answer to God for the choices you make, and I have to answer to God for the choices I make. We can discuss what God has revealed, but the application of it is left to each individual. In the church, for example, we know we're supposed to be prayerful people, but how often should you be praying? We know we should be studying the Bible. How much time do you need to devote to Bible study? We know that we should be evangelistic. We should be sharing our faith. But how to do that, and how much time, and in what setting? All of us need to be very conscientious and reflective on what we're doing. And we should discuss these things among ourselves and encourage one another to be the best Christian that we can be. And yet, we need to step back and make sure we're never attempting to take the place of God in judging other people. But when we have God over humanity, we also find the framework for meaning. First of all, with history. The atheist view is that out of nothing, something came. And out of disorder, there came to be order. And out of insentient material, there came sentient and aware and emotive human beings. And according to the atheist, when one dies, you're just returning to nothing. You came from nothing and you go back to nothing. And as bookends for your life, where is the meaning there? For history, we recognize that if you believe in God, you believe that there's a beginning. And you believe that there's an end. And you believe God is the one who's in control of that. And so that helps provide at least some understanding and some confidence that the world is not going to come to an end cataclysmically by accident. Christian just does not believe that if China and the United States gets into a thermonuclear confrontation, that human life will come to an end unless that is the point where God has decided that history will come to an end. Believing that God is in control provides a framework, and it provides a framework for relationships, because we are able to relate to one another as individuals made in the image of God. And for that reason, we see value in all people. Now, one of the things that Sartre does not tease out in his book, but is implicit, is that you are only of value because of what you do. That only through action do you authenticate yourself. On that basis, there is the possibility, and Heidegger definitely believed this, the good Nazi that he was, that there is life devoid of value. That if someone is incapacitated in such a way that he or she cannot authenticate him or herself through action, then that life is not worth living. It is of no value. It is of no consequence. The only consequence is how you authenticate yourself through your choices. But what happens? What happens when one has reached a point where the mind no longer is functioning, where because of disease or incapacitation of some kind, you are not acting? Well, the atheist position leads inevitably to the disposal of human beings who are not of significant value to society. Yes, Mr. Bell.
Or who slow down the powers that be because they aren't in step.
So, and it does not only in interpersonal relationships, but our relationship in the body politic as well. It is only by believing in God that you are able to say that there is a standard against which power cannot proceed. Francis Schaeffer makes this point, and it's one that we will look at a future time. At some point, we'll be going through how should we then live. But his point is that if there is no absolute by which to judge the state, then the state becomes absolute. Now, this is important because if you look at where civil freedom came from, it came in Western culture from the Bible becoming more accessible to people following the Protestant Reformation, with the idea that that's the word of God. Well, if that's the word of God, then this king or queen cannot rule arbitrarily, because all of the subjects who can read can open that book and can say to the monarch, you are violating the heavenly king's law. And that is what brought about the great liberties that we had. The idea that people can be held accountable. So belief in God provides a framework for understanding history, a framework for human relationships, but it also provides a framework for your life. Now, I do not believe that you can divine the will of God for every moment of your life as if you were reading tea leaves. The idea being, well, the clouds in my coffee are saying this, so I'm going to go down this path. No. But first of all, the Bible teaches that God knows you individually, that when you pray, he hears you and he cares about you. Secondly, there are things that you can know that are the will of God. If you're a Christian and you're married, you don't have to ask, is it the will of God for me to be a faithful husband or wife? He's already told you that's his will. For Christians, is it God's will for me to be part of a congregation? That's not something I should be thinking about. I shouldn't be sitting at home saying, well, should I just sit home or should I find a group of Christians with whom to worship? God's told you. Now, which congregation to be part of? Well, God has told you certain things, and if you find a church that is obviously in violation with the will of God, well, you shouldn't be there. But in terms of, should I be here, or perhaps I should be across town at a sister congregation that is following God's will? Well, you have to sort that out. And there are many things: what career to follow, what education to get, whether to marry. All of those kinds of things are very much a matter of stewardship. You're accountable to God for the choices you make, but God's not going to tell you every nook and cranny of your life. However, you have this assurance: He is always there. And if you are faithful to Him, your life will be blessed. That doesn't mean that you will be economically prosperous. That doesn't mean you will be free from disease. It doesn't mean you'll get along with other people. In point of fact, the Bible's pretty clear that God's people likely are going to face problems of all sorts. But it's also clear that if you are right with God, that it will be all right for you in the end. And even right now, with what really matters, things are all right. This is the answer that we have, and the points of engagement where I believe that the message of the Christian gospel, the good news, is much more attractive than the forlorn, hopeless despair that you find in atheism.